Let me just kind of dive in. So I'll talk about what team leadership is from a team's perspective. Talk about the role that leadership plays in teams and why leadership is so important. And then we'll end with kind of translating things into action, specifically talking about some of the behaviors that leaders do. So within the team's domain, a lot of researchers think about leadership in the sense that the job of leadership, the main job, is to do or get done whatever's not being handled for group needs. And that sounds really big, but it's really serving that gap. And a lot of people think of it as social problem solving in that sense. The nice thing, what this does is it opens us up to not only thinking about leadership, and like Chris said, there's a distinction between leadership role and leadership, which is a team process, right? So we talk about leadership a lot, and the team leader often does that, but within this framework, it also opens it up that members of the group can also engage in these leadership activities, and that's another strength of teams. So when we think about, what do leaders do, what they really do is, if you think about that notion of social problem solving, they're facilitating the conditions for teams to be effective. And that's why I say they're so instrumental. You can have a good leader that can push the team above and beyond, and then you can have toxic leaders that no matter, how good the team is, it can really hurt the team. Richard Hackman is kind of the father of team leadership. He was at Harvard. He's no longer with us. So, but you'll see that I cite a lot of his work. And really, in thinking about this, there are 5 ways, if you will, that leaders work to facilitate the conditions for team effectiveness. Number one, and I'll go into each of these in more detail, but number one is, do I have a real team? Oftentimes, sometimes we get things pushed at us where they think, hey, a team is needed for this activity, but it really isn't a team activity. So that's the first thing. I really need to go to the effort, because it is effort to pull together a team. The second enabling condition is, does the team have compelling direction? Third is, does it have an enabling structure? And here, we'll talk quite a bit here. I'll bring in a little bit of team composition stuff here. The fourth condition is there a supportive organizational context? And the last one is whether or not expert coaching is available. That does not mean that the leader has to do the expert coaching, but just from a developmental standpoint, that it is available to the team. Okay. So kind of moving through these. The first one is, setting it up to make sure that it's a real team. So does it have a team task? And what I mean by that is, we alluded to that one of the foundational notions of teams is this idea of interdependence. And here, that's what you see kind of on the right-hand side. And it really doesn't matter that you know what the names are. But for me, the first one, the two things that you see at the top left, is more, it's a group. So there's a whole bunch of people and there's inputs going in and out, but they're not really working together. There's no requirement. So for me, teams start with this notion of sequential interdependence. And the easiest way to think about this is an assembly line. Or if you're developing or implementing an intervention, maybe that's in a stepped pattern. So I do part of the work. The input of my task then goes in to feed the next person as their input. So let's say that, I write the introduction to the proposal, that then feeds what kind of methods we're going to use, which feed, or I guess actually the tasks will feed, and then that feeds the methods. So it's coordination that's happening between members. They're interdependent, but it's all unidirectional. It's just going one way. The other two that you see kind of on the right-hand side here, reciprocal and interdependence, they differ in the sense that now they're more intensive forms of coordination and interdependence. So now you've got bidirectional interdependence. So, we're really working together back and forth. We're brainstorming within the team to decide on what's the best approach that we want to take as we combine all of our different areas of expertise. And the reason that it's important here is because the more interdependent that your team is, the more these things that Chris and I have been talking about come into play. So is there a team task? That's kind of the independent stuff. Does the team have clear boundaries? And although we recognize that teams have boundaries within teams have become somewhat fuzzier, within the last 10 or so years, maybe a little more than that. Still, the team needs to have a good understanding of who is in and who is outside the team. Does the team have some degree of authority to manage their work processes? If everything they're doing is being dictated by somebody else and there's really no flexibility, it makes it very difficult. And then the last one here is the degree of membership stability. So teams have when this work first came out, people would argue that teams have membership stability. Now people argue teams have a degree of membership stability, right? So we know that members rotate in and out of teams. But again, there needs to be some degree of stability. If everybody's changing all the time, it makes it very difficult to do any of this stuff and get on the same page as Chris and I have been talking about. The second thing that leaders do is they help to ensure that the team has a compelling direction, right? Compelling direction kind of, lets me know what's my purpose, what am I supposed to be doing? And even if, sometimes the direction from higher down from the organization may not be as clear, but then it's here to go back and double check that so that when they get to the point that they're talking to their team about what's the task and what we're supposed to be doing, it has these attributes. So it's clear. That serves to orient the team and allows them to understand, what's our goal? What are we doing? It's challenging, right? I'm sure we've all had some tasks that, somebody was asking us to do, and they're challenging, but they're so challenging that we know we can't get them completed. Well, that's not energizing. That's just frustrating. And literature on goal setting, ties into that. So you want direction that challenges the team because that motivates them and energizes them. And then the last attribute of compelling direction is that it's consequential. So it lets me know kind of what the outcome is, why I'm doing this. And again, that engages the team and lets them see that what they're doing has meaning. The third characteristic that we'll spend a little bit of time on is ensuring that the team has an enabling structure. One of the aspects about this are, and Chris talked about this a lot during the last session, but do we have core norms of conduct established for how we're going to work? All of those things that Chris said before apply here. I'd also say that in terms of, now we're talking about these multidisciplinary teams, that you want to set up norms to encourage team members to capitalize on that diversity. So encouraging that psychologically safe environment where members are free to speak up. We also need to have norms that promote the real-time adjustment of strategy, environmental scanning. So that's, we had talked about I mentioned boundary spanners earlier. So someone that's making sure that the team is remaining adaptive to what's going on in the environment, whether that's, what's working, working with a customer or a client, or whether that my intervention is now being implemented. And are there things within the environment where we need to adjust some of our strategy? And then the last thing under norms is team self-correction, which again, at its most basic, is teams reflecting on what's going well and what's not going well, or maybe not going as well as they would like, and not kind of getting entrenched in one path forward, which can be a danger of teams sometimes. The second part of enabling structure is just making sure is the work designed well. So can the members identify with it? Do they see the task as meaningful? Again, no one wants to do work that they don't perceive as having any meaning. When I think about this, I think about, sometimes our grad students, and at least my grad students, and you're writing a proposal and someone's got to go and find all the references. Well, is that the funnest task in the world? No. But can we frame it in a way so that they understand how it fits in with the larger picture of what we're doing and make it meaningful as a learning experience? Work that's designed well, again, allows members to have a sense of autonomy. They have some input, some leeway in terms of how they're doing their work. And again, they're also able to obtain some degree of feedback from the work itself. And I would imagine that when a lot of the contexts that you guys are operating within, that might be one of the most salient aspects as you start to work with clients in the community and you actually implementing interventions, working with that customer to kind of get some of what that feedback is. The last one on here is how should I compose my team? So this talks about composition stuff. and ensuring that the team has the adequate mix of knowledges, skills, abilities, it's the right size. So a lot of those things on the input side that we mentioned early on. So I'm going to go into this a little bit, but I'm going to note right now, I am not a team composition person, but I'm going to try to give you some of the basics here. So one thing I think is really important here is, organizations generally don't hire for teams, they hire for individuals. I think one of the nice things when we're talking about, science teams, research teams, where you're trying to pair with the community, is we have a little bit more leeway there, right? We can think about, to some degree, we get some choice about who we want to work with. So in doing that, what people have argued is obviously we need, because we are interacting and this is an interdependent activity, we need some social skills, right? And those are some of the things, so coordination, persuasion. We need to be able to negotiate because we know that there's going to be people coming in with different types of ideas. A big one for me is social perceptiveness. So I need to be able to read those cues. People aren't getting it, or guess what? I'm really making this person upset. How can I kind of work to mitigate that? Personality. There are a couple things here. In general, if people are familiar with big personality research, Big Five tends to correlate with lots of stuff. So no difference here. People that are extroverted, agreeable, that tends to relate to the building of cohesion. Obviously, we want people that are emotionally stable on the teams, and conscientiousness helps with kind of task completion. And then there's this bucket that we've kind of been talking about throughout this morning, which are the KSAs that really relate to teamwork stuff. So as we're thinking about this, one of the things we think about when we're devising the team is, what's the right mixture? And, there's a real emphasis on diversity now for a number of reasons, and diversity is good. It's not always good, but it's good in some places, and in other places it's good, but we just need to be careful. So I tried to pull some of the work that's going on. So we know, for example, that high levels of conscientiousness, so that would be homogeneity of conscientiousness, that's good for performance. We know that having a mixture of, I just said this, but extroversion and agreeableness is good for cohesion. Getting into some more of the heterogeneous stuff that's coming more out of the science community, science teams, academic science teams, if you will. Publications with gender heterogeneous teams have been found to receive 34% more citations than same gender teams. I don't have a good rationale for that, but it's also been found that having at least one female PI increases the likelihood of funding and innovative ideas. It might be that oftentimes there's differences in terms of gender and the way that people work within teams. So that might be part of this. Let's see. Involving senior personnel, this probably isn't a surprise, but involving senior personnel can lead to publications in higher impact journals, right? They know how to navigate the landscape. So what can we learn from that? The last one here is that smaller teams are more likely to develop innovative research. And again, the idea here is, someone I think asked about team size earlier, you don't want, the more people you add onto your team, the more coordination demands you have on your team, right? So we want just enough to get the task done that we need to get done, but not so much that it's going to add just additional workload. Still kind of driving that idea of diversity. When we think about diversity, we talk about the characteristics of my service, right? So I can look at my team members and I can see differences in race, sex, age, maybe even dress, and in some cases, depending on who I'm working with, I may even be able to see some surface level features of reputation. For example, if you're working with militaries or doctors, nurses, there's a status thing there just by the way that they're dressing. And that's kind of the first thing that we pick up on. And that service level diversity within a team begins to form our impressions about our expectations about that person. Oftentimes those are stereotypes. But as we move forward, it's actually not those surface level features that cause problems for teams. What tends to cause problems are more these deep level features. So these underlying psychological characteristics personality traits, the cultural value stuff, things that remain hidden. Because if I see you and you look like me, we have a tendency to assume that you are like me. And so I put my expectations and I attribute the way that I would act to you. So it's really these deep level things that we need to be, that we think about. And there are, what do I want to say here? I'll come back to that. So when we're thinking about diversity, right, we want the right mixture for what we need. At the same time, what we're thinking about is what we don't want is this diversity to create a fault line. So on the right-hand side, you see like a fault line in terms of, the earth. And it's the same thing within teams. Fault lines are these hypothetical dividing lines that split your group into subgroups. And that's obviously not a good thing. You tend to have, for the most part, fault lines have tended to be looked at more along those surface level features. So if I have, 4 people on the team, and let's say I've got 2 males and 2 females, this is just an easy example, you could potentially get a fault line on gender. Now, if I have those same 4 people and my 2 females are also psychologists, that group's going to be more likely to split than if I have the same gender ratio, but my discipline configuration, maybe I have a psychologist that's a female and a psychologist that's a male. So the more common attributes that they can group on, the more likely the literature would argue that you might have a fault line within your team. With that being said, fault lines aren't always bad, because if they remain dormant, so I can see them, but no one really calls attention to them, so they're not salient to me, then it's not going to matter. The example that I gave about the psychologists on the team, females with 2 psychologists, that might become very, very salient if the other group is, engineers, for example. So the more salient those features are, the more likely they are to cause an actual fault line. And that's bad, because then you begin to potentially get into this us versus them mindset within the team. Now, we do know that there's ways we can mitigate this. So forming a superordinate, a higher level identity that serves to bring the team together is one way that people talk about to mitigate fault lines, as well as some composition. I kind of just talked about this, but this is the notion of when we're thinking about team composition, that the context that you're operating in will drive how salient some of these things are. So here's an example. The second bullet talks about the fact that the relationship between team personality composition and team performance, there was a stronger relationship there under conditions of high interdependence, right? We have to work more closely. So if I have a mixture of personality compositions that don't gel as well, it's going to have a stronger impact on performance. The flip side of that is that if you're in a very strong situation where the team does not have a whole lot of leeway in what they're doing, that may limit the extent to which some of these differences translate in behaviors. If all my actions are being dictated by somebody above me and I don't have flexibility in my processes, that would be considered like a strong situation. So there's been quite a bit of work, like I said, team composition and how do you create the best composition for a particular task is work that has been ongoing. As there are advances in technology, there's a lot of people, not a lot of people, but there's people within on the research side that are working to build tools that will allow people to kind of plug and play, if you will. I know the team member's personality and I know what their knowledge, skills, and abilities, and through computational modeling, I'm able, they're developing programs that allow you to say, okay, well, if I put these 4 or 5 type of people on here, what's going to be the impact on how the team works together? So that's emerging work that will hopefully at some point filter down, because it would make this stuff a lot easier. But just in thinking about how to enable a good structure from a compositional standpoint, I would just say, it's not always about selecting the best individual members, but who's the best scholar for this team. I think diversity is critical. It's just about managing that diversity and doing some of that stuff that Chris talked about on the front end to kind of work through that. And then making sure that your research team or your community partner team, doesn't get too unwieldy so that you have so much of this additional overload. I think this is maybe the fourth one. It's having a supportive organizational context. So team leaders work to help to ensure that the right reward systems are in place, or at least to communicate to the organization what the reward systems should be, or they can set the in terms of if I expect teamwork, and this goes back to some of the academic stuff, if I'm going to expect, if I value teamwork, then I need to reward teamwork. Information systems speaks to the idea of, are there mechanisms through which does the organization make it easier to communicate and collaborate? That could be technology systems. It can also kind of come into play when we're talking about academics, credit splits and stuff like that, and how do you work across those? And then lastly is, does the organization offer training opportunities? And that just goes back to making sure that people have the right task-related skills. The last one here is expert coaching. So in this case, team leaders need to make sure that expert coaching is available for the team. And this is about building teamwork, not doing the team's work, right? So the coach doesn't come in and do it, but they're going to focus on those areas where the team might seem to be faltering. And in general, there are three kind of broad areas that work is talked about that within teams, coaches come in and work on. The first one is effort. So there we're trying to minimize social loafing. So that is a potential problem within teams, is that someone can kind of sit in the background and maybe not pull their weight. So we're trying to move people towards having that high shared commitment, and having that commitment serves to reduce social loafing. There's also coaching that revolves around focusing on performance strategy. So again, teams that are working together over time, it's very easy to get entrained, and entrainment has some good things, but to kind of get on the same page. But sometimes we get on the same page and we get so locked into our routines that we put blinders on, right? And performance strategy coaching is trying to mitigate that problem. And then the last type of coaching is knowledge and skill, and that deals with, again, the inappropriate weighting of member contributions. So having a coach come in that can facilitate some of the development of transactive memory systems within the team will help them, again, to decide, how do I need to weight that information? Because now I have a better understanding of who has what expertise within the team. The other thing I wanted to point out, and I spoke to this briefly earlier today, and I'll talk about it in more depth when I talk about maintaining, I think it's maintaining teams or sustaining teams tomorrow. But the type of coaching that's available to teams should differ based on where they are in their life cycle. So early on, when the team's first coming together, what you're focusing on is more this motivational kind of coaching. As a team begins to gel as a team, and now they're actually kind of performing the task, it becomes more consultative in nature, right? And this is the type of thing that you can do during the down times that the team has. And then lastly, the educational type of coaching tends to occur most at the, like, I'm done with my task, and now kind of let's do this debrief where we reflect on what went well to help facilitate future knowledge, skills, and abilities, and how that stuff comes together on a team. So just some potential applications, for example, this ties into actually what Chris said, but you can have a launch meeting before work begins, and that can help members to become orientated to the task, become engaged into the task, right? So that's where you're setting up the roles and responsibilities, and that can be a short meeting. There can be coaching where you're providing feedback about the team's problem analysis. Let's say if you're working on a research grant or a community problem. You can also go in and, towards the end, when you're trying to build that kind of knowledge and skill component, you can ask the team kind of reflective questions, right? And this is what we do with some of the debrief work. Why did you take a certain approach, or why was that decision made? And that serves as a learning experience, because often you get so I'll use the word entrainment again, but you get so caught up in what you're doing that sometimes you can play something back for a team and they go, or they'll say, well, we didn't do that. And then we happen to have, we do a lot of simulation work. So you happen to have like a video replay. And no, you kind of did. So again, walking them through some of those reflective questions can help them to build that learning experience. So last couple of minutes. So how do leaders actually facilitate these conditions? Oops, no, won't go away. Sorry. Okay, the way they do that is, again, we take a functional approach to team leadership. So this comes from some work by Fred Morgenson and his colleagues. And we talk about, these are the actions, these are what team leaders do. These are team leadership behaviors. And we kind of break them into, if you go into the teams literature, and I didn't touch on this earlier, but you see people talk about what teams do during their transition phase. So when they're kind of planning, reflecting, and then what they do when they're actually engaged in the task work itself. And that's kind of what you see under the action phase here. So Fred and his colleagues have gone in and kind of begun to highlight, and they've got a measurement instrument that goes along with this that talks about, what are the types of things that leaders should be doing during this transition phase. Okay, so they're composing the team. They're defining the mission, defining the task in the case of what we're talking about. They're establishing expectations and goals. They're working with the team to come up with a structure and a plan for how they want to go about getting to those goals. During the transition phases or downtime, basically, or also when team leaders might step in and work to build team competencies, right? You don't want to do that when you're in the thick of, working under a performance deadline. That doesn't make any sense. They also provide sense making to the team. So they help the team to interpret the environment and what's going on. And then lastly, we've already talked about that, but they provide direction to the team. When the team's actually working on the task, they're helping to monitor. They're managing the team's boundaries. So sometimes leaders will limit the information that comes into a team or the type of information that's coming into a team to potentially preserve some of these affective states, for example. Leaders serve to, and while they're developing the team, they want to challenge the team. So they may come in and play that role of the devil's advocate on the team. They jump in when they're needed. So if they're needed, they actually perform the team task and help out. So they're no different than any other team member in that case. A good leader comes in and they encourage team self-management. And they support the social climate. So again, they work to build this climate of psychological safety where reflection is a good thing. So kind of taking off on the encouraged self-management standpoint, I wanted to bring up briefly this notion of shared leadership. So within teams, we talk a lot about that one way that you can build team capacity and build the resilience of the team is by the leader empowering others within the team and developing leadership capacity within the team. And this notion of shared leadership revolves around this. So it's the idea that instead of saying that leadership has to only be done by a single individual, it's a notion that it's distributed throughout the team. And it's distributed throughout the team. It can be based on, different people have different areas of expertise. That's one of the really cool things about, building multidisciplinary research teams. So somebody may be really good at writing your task statements. Other people may be really good at figuring out the budget, right? And at different points in time, people may step up and take on that leadership role and take the lead in that. It can be distributed based on the fact of different types of workload that are going on within the team. So it's really this notion that it's a shared thing. Now, in order for that to happen, and it's not good in all circumstances, but in order for that to happen, we published some stuff several years ago now that argue that if we're sharing leadership, then there's a couple things that might facilitate that, right? So from a personality dispositional aspect, you need someone that, number one, wants to lead. Some of the personality characteristics in terms of conscientiousness, they need to have active orientation, which they want to do enjoy teamwork. There also needs to be a degree of collective efficacy and psychological safety for a couple of reasons, because within this notion of shared leadership, you often have, this isn't something that you necessarily say, you know, if Chris was here, Chris, you're going to do this part, and Lauren's going to do this part, and Sean's going to do this part, but it's something that often emerges. So there's got to be people willing to step up as well as step back down again. And as a follower, I've got to be willing to grant them that leadership. Just some things, people have looked at this with regards to, is it better as task complexity increases in interdependence, increases early arguments for yes, and right now there's kind of mixed evidence within that. Team tenure has been shown to come into play here, as well as team confidence. So the more confidence, the more likely, the stronger that shared leadership performance relationship is going to be. So in kind of sum right now, you know, we know effective leaders are foundational for team success. Team leaders work to facilitate the conditions for a team success, and you can see kind of the ways that they do that. One thing I want to say is shared leadership has been shown to predict over and above horizontal leadership, but it does not negate the fact that there's still a horizontal leader. There can still be that, and that person kind of sets up the conditions within the team.